Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation today on living with disinformation. We've all been through a global pandemic, a political insurrection, a racial justice reckoning, and each of these are profoundly impacted by social media and the disinformation that can be found there. So at this point in 2021, the fact that fake news exists is no longer a surprise to anyone. So with that in mind, today we're going to look out to the horizon about what's next with technology, regulation, and how to stay vigilant against new players trying to influence the media and the public. To discuss it all, I am thrilled to introduce our panel today. Karen Kornbluh is the Senior Fellow and Founding Director of the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund. She served as U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and as Policy Director for then Senator Barack Obama. Krishna Gade is the founder and CEO of Fiddler, a machine learning monitoring company. Prior to Fiddler, Krishna led the team that built Facebook's explainability feature, Why Am I Seeing This?, and has also held senior engineering leadership roles at Pinterest, Twitter, and Microsoft. And finally, Mary McCord is executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and visiting professor of law at Georgetown University, specializing in many sectors of law, including First Amendment rights and combating the rise of private paramilitaries. So I am so excited to talk with you all today, and there's a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. The three of you have a wide range of specialties that bump up against each other in different aspects of the misinformation space. So I'd like to hear first from each of you about how exactly mis and disinformation affects what you do and the major challenges that you find in your day-to-day life. So Karen, why don't you kick it off for us?
Oh, thanks so much. And Sarah, this is such a thrill to be on this panel. I'm really looking forward to learning from everybody, especially given the times we're living in. And that brings me to, how this intersects with what I work on. I've worked on internet policy going back to the early days of the commercialization of the internet, when we assumed that the design of the internet was automatically pro-democracy. It was going to bring voice to the voiceless, power to the powerless. It was this infant industry that we just needed to unleash on the world, and democracy would spread. It's become clear that was out of date. And it was clear even when I was in the Obama administration and at the OECD, we negotiated internet policy-making principles to try to encourage countries to update the early policy framework. And of course, it became clearer still with the Russian interference in the 2016 election. So I came to the German Marshall Fund, where I am now, to work on how do we really internationally restore a pro-democracy internet? What kind of policy framework do we need? And to answer your question about the big challenge, the challenge is this focus that so much of the public debate has, and that even the platforms have had, on whether or not to take down a specific piece of content after it's gone viral. It's a completely ineffective game of whack-a-mole. An example is the Frontline Doctors video, but there are a million others. This is a long video that said Fauci was the enemy, masks were terrible for you, hydrochloroquine was a good idea. It took many hours for all of the platforms to realize it violated their terms of service and take it down. But in the meantime, it had achieved millions and millions of views and done its damage. But also the whack-a-mole game raises all these First Amendment issues. And what we are urging folks to focus on instead is the fact that these disinformation campaigns have parked their networks of outlets, pages, influencers, channels, groups, and they're primed for new conspiracy theories at the drop of a hat. And that's what I'm really concerned about, that we're not focusing on that.
Fascinating. Krishna, why don't we go next to you? Tell us about how your world is affected by misinformation.
Yeah, so I think the story of Fiddler is heavily linked to this topic of misinformation. So if you think about it, right, we're in this world of algorithms that are determining a lot of stuff that we consume, from news content to whatever we browse online, and the algorithms are becoming more and more complex over time, and when they recommend things to you, for example, what Karen was mentioning, these stories can go really viral. And that's what we have experienced at Facebook as well, where When I was working at Facebook, we would use a lot of AI and machine learning algorithms to recommend news content, advertisements to the users. And sometimes it was very difficult to understand how these news stories were getting amplified at scale. Why is a particular news story going viral suddenly? And sometimes sort of people who try to like game the system, they package misinformation in a manner that is very difficult for these AI algorithms to decipher, to distinguish between what's original, what's accurate versus what's in misinformation. And so this is where, from a technology point of view, it became really important to understand and sort of explain these algorithms, how they are working. And so I worked on that at Facebook, building an explainable AI toolkit that developers can use there to build better AI algorithms over time. And that's what motivated me to start Fiddler, with this mission to help companies build trustworthy AI. So yeah, we work with a variety of companies, including social media, news companies as our customers, where we're helping them to distinguish what's how is the model, how are these algorithms working, how are they distinguishing between what's correct, what's not correct, and sort of helping them build better products for their end users.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you a lot more about that coming up. And Mary, why don't you tell us about your world and about how misinformation is a challenge?
Sure. So I had, before helping to launch ICAP at Georgetown, my career had been at the Department of Justice in national security and in criminal prosecution. And so even carrying into the private sector, doing public interest work out of Georgetown, my organization has still focused very much on how disinformation has fueled actual, violence on the ground, extremism, the spread of extremism, and infringed on, which has a result of infringing on constitutional rights. So let me just unpack that for a little bit. We have seen historically, when I was in government working in counterterrorism, that the ability of extremists to recruit, propagandize, radicalize people was so much greater used by ISIS than by Al Qaeda, because ISIS had access to social media, something that Al Qaeda back in the day, as it was really getting a foothold, just didn't have access to. And that ability to use these platforms to reach out to so many people around the globe in nanoseconds was incredibly effective by that foreign terrorist organization, ISIS. And I'm not trying to necessarily equate all domestic ideological groupings with terrorists, of course, but we do see that extremist organizations in the US, whether we're talking about white supremacist organizations, anti-government accelerationist organizations. By accelerationist, I mean those who are advocating an acceleration toward a revolution or a civil war, oftentimes with the idea of creating a white ethno-state. Conspiracy theorist organizations and militia violent extremist organizations all have similarly used social media and internet platforms to, again, recruit, propagandize, monetize, raise money online, and radicalize. And we've seen that so, in living color in this last year during the pandemic, when one bit of disinformation after another was used to bring these groups together, I think culminating in the January 6th insurrection. So we had disinformation originally about the pandemic. We had a lot of online recruitment of people to be in opposition to governor's stay-at-home orders on this theory that the pandemic was a hoax. We had disinformation about racial justice demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd that suggested that Black Lives Matter movement and other primarily peaceful movements for racial justice were in actuality, violent anarchists bent on looting and rioting, which caused extremists to come out, including militias, to come out and ostensibly to protect private property. But in doing so, we saw lethal and tragic results like shootings and killings in Kenosha and elsewhere. And then we saw, of course, all of the disinformation, both before and after the election, about fraud and ballot box stuffing and dead people voting, none of which has any basis in fact, which has been thrown out by multiple courts across the country. But that narrative, that false narrative propounded on social media, is what brought all of the extremist groups to Washington, D.C. on January 6th and resulted in the attack on the Capitol, which is a fundamental undermining of our democracy. So what I worry about the most is that, if this type of disinformation continues, this is the glue, this is the coalescing narrative that often brings extremist groups together. They may have different ideological bents at the margins, but they are really good about coalescing around one thing. Stop the steal. Now they're coalescing around the former president being reinstated in August as a result of voter fraud. Like these false narratives that spread, that's what brings extremists together, and that can result in violence, as we've seen, and in a fundamental undermining of our democracy, which we've also seen, and the infringement of other people's First Amendment rights. Other people who want to peacefully exercise their First Amendment rights to free speech, other people who want to peacefully go petition their elected officials in state houses across the country, in county board meetings, and have to run the gauntlet of extremists intimidating or coercing. So this is what, from my little corner of the world, this is what I've been focusing on.
So, Krishna, I want to ask you, so we've heard from everybody kind of, really is the gambit of how misinformation affects kind of all of us in all of our daily lives. But the one thing that's kind of different in the recent past is AI. And not only social media, that surely is a thing, but this kind of insurgency of AI has really changed the playing field. So can you help our audience understand like the relationship in some detail about the relationship between AI and misinformation?
Absolutely. So AI at a high level is a technology that can help machines detect patterns in data and try to predict the future. Right? That's at a high level. That's how it works. So, for example, when you're applying AI for information broadcasting or news recommendation or advertising type use cases, how it is trained is you basically use your older data, your historical data, say for example, a social media company may have, all the news articles that were, shown to the users, which news articles were engaged by the users, which were not getting engaged. And they feed this information to the AI system to sort of learn patterns, which information is getting more engagement from the users, which information is not, so that when new news arrives, the algorithms can then amplify certain news articles, can learn to essentially broadcast and distribute more content that is more engaging for the users, right? So now the problem with this approach is if the information, let's say if the AI algorithm can be gamed, now you can actually create a content or multiple, sets of news articles that appear, correct from the algorithm's point of view, but could package misinformation here and there, right? And this can be done in a very nuanced manner. And now those news articles can then be broadcasted, to a wide variety of audience, and as a result, can cause the societal damage that Mary and Karen were alluding to. The implication with AI is because it is becoming more and more complex over time in terms of how these algorithms are getting created. The aspect of this human transparency, this human level understanding of how it works, is becoming important. And so that's what we are trying to help companies develop. It's not just sufficient to have your AI systems to increase your business metrics, increase your engagement, but if you do not know how those systems are working, at a fundamental level, if you don't have transparency into it, then you could really cause a lot of damage, right? You can essentially amplify bias, you can amplify societal division, you can amplify misinformation amongst your customers, and could in the long run this could be damaging for the company itself, right? And it could help you lose, it could actually essentially make you lose customer trust. So we are essentially our approach is there when you are developing these AI algorithms, when and sort of that are being trained on this historical data, try to see like how they're working. We provide a lens for to develop various practitioners within the organization, from developers to legal compliance folks to product and business stakeholders, to come to one table and see how these algorithms are working, and give them a lens to look into what kind of patterns they're detecting, how these models, they're called models, how these models are making predictions. And so therefore, and then monitor them continuously, so therefore they can catch these issues before they become too large, right? And sort of affect in the society and the user base in a big way. So that's kind of in a nutshell how what are the challenges. And it's a very very technically hard problem, and it also requires organizational buy-in from the company's point of view to actually adopt in this process, and the tools that companies like us are developing as well.
So, we've seen a lot of the conversation around QAnon and other sorts of like really hardcore conspiracy theory kind of dry up over these last, I don't know, 6 months or so. I know the German Marshall Fund recently put out a report saying that engagement with deceptive sites has dropped dramatically. So, Karen, what do you think about how effective the companies can be, like when they want to be, when they really, kind of like what Krishna was saying, when they are, made aware and make a, conscious effort to really say, okay, we're stopping this. What do you think that says about them and the fact that it's still going on? Can you talk a little bit about that and where the onus is on the private sector to really be responsible for democracy at large?
Yeah, so I would break that into the two parts that you suggested. One is what could they do something, and the second is like what do we need to do to make that happen. They definitely could do more, and that study that we did after the election showed that when they're determined to take down pieces of these disinformation networks, and they do it, there is an impact. So they took down some large accounts that were that were linchpins in these networks, spreading information from, for instance, Gateway Pundit. And when you take out one of these big accounts that has amassed a huge audience and connects to a bunch of other influencers and other pages and YouTube channels, it does take down the viewership of content from an outlet like that. So we were pleased to see that. It dropped a lot on Twitter, the engagement with these deceptive outlets, less on Facebook, but still we saw an uptick in engagement with the more trustworthy sites. So that shows me that they can do it. It obviously wasn't enough. There was still an enormous amount of COVID, for example, misinformation, and all the things that Mary said were going on continually through the quarter. I think Krishna sort of hints at the problem. The problem is if you've constructed this machine, and it is a machine, and you've optimized for how much traffic there's going to be, how many eyeballs are on the system, it's very hard to counteract that machine, to outguess it with a few, societally we'd like to have a little less of this and a little less of that. You're continually doing catch up. You can never have enough resources on it. So you have to optimize. You have to change the platform's incentives so that they're optimizing for some of the things that society wants. Right now, they can externalize the harms and they get the revenue benefits, which, by the way, no longer go to journalism. So we're seeing mainstream journalism dry up. So what we have to do is, just like with pollution, just like with a whole bunch of other things we've found ways to regulate, we have to change their incentives so they internalize those costs to society. And so there are a bunch of things. If you look at the algorithm, as Krishna suggested, the outlets that are just pumping out disinformation, breaking their terms of service, these networks of influencers, there are all kinds of things that, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission or the SEC or the Federal Election Commission, if it were functional, or the DOJ could do to, just for starters, enforce a bunch of rules and protections that we have in the offline world, in the online world. And, you know, Mary has a bunch of ideas on this, but that's where I would start. Then there's a bunch of stuff that, for reasons, we don't want the government telling the platforms what to do. And they need to have a lot more transparency. They need to slow down the virality, and that they can do with a code of conduct, but that's transparent. So we can talk about more of that later, but their incentives have to be changed to make them take this really seriously, and then use their incredible power of algorithms, user interface design to accomplish what we'd all like to see.
Yeah, just to chime in here, I think that's a great point. I said, we need organizational buy-in to, mend these processes and install responsible AI or responsible ways of building these algorithms. But we cannot just rely on the corporate responsibility, right? We need regulations. We need things like pretty good policies that are in Congress today, Algorithmic Accountability Act, and so on and so forth. And if we can actually have some of these implemented, and then we can at least have some way of holding these companies accountable so that they can introduce these processes and tools to make sure that their algorithms are working properly.
So let's actually talk about regulation. That was one of the things I wanted to talk about today. So, Mary, what do you think? What do you think is next up? Like, do you actually think it'll happen? And if it does happen, what would you expect it looks like?
So it's a great question, because there's such an enormous, vast array of possibilities when we talk about regulation. And I do think it's important for people to understand two different types of regulation. One is sort of direct regulation of social media companies. The other is reform of Section 230 to the Communications Decency Act. And the reason I think it's important to keep these separated, although there are overlaps, and some of Karen's writings really, I think, bring some of these overlaps to light that we can talk about. But when we're talking about direct regulation of social media companies, when it comes to content, that raises immediate First Amendment issues, because even though the social media companies and the internet platforms are private companies and are not bound by the First Amendment, the government is. So if the government imposes regulations on social media companies that are viewpoint related, that is, subject to challenge for being a First Amendment violation. Social media companies, again, they can actually do whatever they want in terms of content, and that will not be a First Amendment violation. If they engage in racial discrimination or things like that, they might be subject to other liability, but not First Amendment liability, because they're not bound. And I do think in some cases, private companies want the public to think that they're bound by the First Amendment, because it gives them a nice sort of shield to their own bad behavior and their own neglect of some of the dangerous content on their platforms, but they're not bound. So when the government does it, they have to be very careful that the government doesn't engage in viewpoint discrimination. And there are things, and some of these are things I've taken directly from Karen's writing, so I don't want to, I want to let her talk about them, but things like regulating so that companies have to have transparent processes for how they engage in content moderation, rationales for that, appealable processes, things like that. The government can require that, which pushes companies to have to do it in a way that they are comfortable being transparent about it, and then have to live up to it. But then Section 230, I think we should talk about separately. The Communications Decency Act, Section 230, is really an immunity that has been incredibly broadly interpreted by the courts, that essentially gives providers immunity from any type of liability, civil liability, for harms done based on content that third parties put on their platforms. And this means, this was sort of well motivated when it was passed. The idea was to give space for the internet to grow, and also to discourage content or internet service platforms from putting their head in the sand and not taking down content. It was actually, oddly enough, meant to give them immunity if they decide to take down obscene, harassing, etc. content. the immunity was to not treat them like a publisher, like a book publisher, and to allow them to be able to do that. So in fact, the original provision was called, oh gosh, it was like the family, oh, help me out here. The Internet Freedom and Family Empowerment Act, because it was about taking down the type, freedom to take down the type of content that could be harmful to families. So over the course of time, like I said, it's been interpreted so broadly that it's actually, the very provisions that have in their title Good Samaritan immunity are actually abused by bad Samaritans who use that immunity to, in some cases, very much encourage the kind of content that can end up being very harmful to people. And so there's such a variety of reforms under consideration. It could run the gamut from things like regulation of paid advertisement, regulation of, or I shouldn't say regulation, I should say exemptions from immunity for paid advertisements, for algorithmic amplification of certain content. It could involve things like a notice and responsibility to take down once a platform is put on notice of content that is harmful or harassing or threatening, etc., that there's an obligation to take it down. It could be, or else face potential liability. It could be a reasonableness standard, judging whether what the company is doing in order to obtain immunity is actually something that's reasonable. So there's and there's on and on and on, all kinds of additional possibilities. And I can't predict which of any of these things are going to be agreed on in Congress. I can say that many members of Congress think that there should be reforms, but the question is, but they view the reforms differently. Some think that the social media companies are taking down too much content. That's particularly a conservative viewpoint, taking down too much conservative content without any due process, for lack of a better word. Others think there's too much harmful content up there, and social media companies should be taking down more of it. So I think, we're going to see hearings, I'm sure, through this next session of Congress. I think we'll see a lot of experts, and I think we'll see, but I can't tell you exactly what's going to come.
Karen, Mary mentioned a lot of your writing. Can you tell us a little bit about your take on regulation and what you see when you look into your crystal ball?
Yeah, I just want to totally endorse what Mary said, that the government should not be in the business of regulating content or regulating platforms insofar as it's about content issues. But there's a long tradition of, for example, the Federal Trade Commission caring about deception and deceiving consumers. So if you look at something like a deep fake, a video that's made to look like somebody is saying something that they're not saying or doing something that they're not doing, the FTC could arguably, under its current authority, do something about that. Or there's another clever design treat called Dark Patterns. And everybody's familiar with this. You go to a website and you're kind of tricked, or it just is easier for you to give up your data or do something that you don't necessarily want to do. It's a hassle to do anything else. That's a dark pattern where you're convinced the design gets you to do something that's sort of against your self-interest. You could imagine the FTC deciding that too is something they can deal with without legislation. A little further afield, maybe it isn't under their current authority, but some have argued that it is. They could require more transparency so that you could know what's going on when you're online. So the analogy I use is, if there is a plane crash, we get the black box flight data recorder and we know what happened, and then it's analyzed, and then the information is given to the FAA so they can decide we need to tweak the regulations. There's no black box flight data recorder for what's happening online. So we don't know what the platforms mean when they say we've taken down 40%, 50%, like of what? Mm-hmm. What stayed up? The only reason we know so much about what happened in 2016, and that the Russians, for example, targeted African Americans to stay home and targeted whites to be suspicious of African Americans and did so much on anti-immigration, is because the Senate Intelligence Committees made the platforms give up that data. Otherwise, we don't have that data about 2020. We just don't have it. So those kinds of things that are purely about procedure and process and sound really boring, but they can affect what comes out at the other end much more than if we worry about this individual piece of content after it has already blown up and gone viral. We want to get at the problem before that. And I think that stuff is possible. It is a scary thing to have the government anywhere near speech. So everybody's really right to be cautious of that. The First Amendment, and people from other countries who criticize the First Amendment and say we're too much absolutists, they care about free expression too. It's a basic international human right. So we have to be very, very careful. But I think there are things that can be done that are purely procedural and enhance transparency, which enhances free expression.
So no talk about mis and disinformation would be complete about really going over Facebook's role in it as, the biggest social network in the world. We've all seen Mark Zuckerberg sitting in front of Congress talking about regulation. Krishna, you used to work at Facebook and you used to work with the newsfeed at that. So they've been, really criticized about how they have handled misinformation in the past. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with the newsfeed, what that was like?
Yeah, I think it was a great, interesting experience. I joined Facebook, a week after the 2016 elections, and the 2 years I spent there were very interesting, very challenging. Facebook has massive scale, right? And a lot of what we do, or whatever Facebook sort of suffered during those times in terms of customer trust and not, is pretty much every technology company has the same problems. It's just that Facebook came to limelight. The problems are the same things, right? So it comes down to do you have any sort of risk assessments in place when you're developing algorithms? Do you have any processes in place to ensure how they're working, how they're affecting, not just from a business metrics point of view, but also how they're predicting the outcomes and whatnot. And if you sort of think about it, and this is why I kind of come back to that, having some sort of a regulatory body that can do this. So we actually at Fiddler, we work with a different sector, like financial services. And financial services, when they came out of the 2008 debacle, there was this very interesting regulation that was put down called SR 11.7, which really mandates every bank and every sort of financial organization to do ongoing risk assessments of their models, whatever models that they're actually using. And so this actually put in place in the last 10 years very well-defined processes on how to develop models, how to develop algorithms. There's an external regulator that can come and check in once in a while, and this black box recorder that Karen was alluding to. You have to create an audit trail of how all the decisions that your models are making, and someone asks you, you should be able to show these things. None of these exist in technology companies. There's no sort of audit trail. There is absolutely no way to go back in time what really happened, right? And there's no sort of governance around the algorithms that are being developed and an oversight from a compliance team, right? And so this is something what Facebook went through, and when we were caught off guard, right? And we were basically we were not the only technology company developing sophisticated algorithms, but because we were in the sort of the public eye and sort of the product was used by billions of people, the effects were like much larger. And so in particular, as I said in the beginning, newsfeed is essentially a ranking system. It takes all the content that you can see on Facebook and ranks in the order of how likely you're going to engage with that content. Now, there are a multitude of algorithms that come in play to actually do this. Now, the problem that we had was we didn't have a great way to understand even a simple question like, why am I seeing this story, right? And so like, for example, an exec might see a pretty bad advertisement and they might say, hey, like, why is the story coming in my feed? And so we, on my team, on our side, we built tools to, create this transparency. In fact, I would say like Facebook productized one of the first explainability tools and features called why am I seeing this, and even kind of productized it to the end user. And they had to they did it because we saw all of this thing happening in front of our eyes, right? And when I basically started Fiddler and I talked to other companies, other technology companies, they don't sort of act with the same sort of urgency, because they're like, oh no, it's not happening yet to us, right? So therefore, I know we can't wait more Facebooks to happen, for this to, so that for everybody to adopt these type of practices and technologies. And this is where we need some sort of third party involvement, some like a government sort of involvement here. And yeah, so that's kind of what sort of entailed at Facebook, and what sort of how we started Fiddler.
So so Karen talked a little bit about changing incentives for the social platforms. Krishna, I'm curious what you think about, just conceptually doing that at the larger social platforms. I mean, they're making a ton of money doing it the way they're doing it right now. So, if they change their incentives, would that change? And, will they do it on their own, essentially?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I don't think there is huge trade-offs in actually building responsible AI and not, benefiting from it. In fact, I would say it's kind of like the long-term benefits, right? As a social media company or whatever company that is actually using AI, you're using it to enhance your customer experience. AI is beneficial in many ways, right? So it simplifies a lot of things for us. It automates a lot of things that require a lot of manual work. But the problem is, if you don't practice a certain set of processes to build it, then it can also cause damage at a larger scale. And what we are trying to advocate for is a set of processes while developing these algorithms and deploying them, while testing them and monitoring them, so that you have this continuous oversight into what's going on. And this is not in an opposite direction to like optimization of your engagement metrics or business metrics. In fact, if you do it right, you actually can build better models, better algorithms that can do both, that can actually enhance, whatever business metrics you're trying to optimize, but still make sure that, your customers, not making biased decisions for your customers, or, you're not making any unethical sort of, predictions. And then you still retain the ability to go back in time and see what happened with your AI system.
So I want to jump back in time a little bit. Mary, I want to ask you about the January 6th Capitol insurrection. I've been reading some of the defense claims about how misinformation is being essentially used as a defense. A lot of the people that were there are saying that they were brainwashed. And I just wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about that, like your thoughts on that from a legal perspective. And then I wanted to also ask you about this deplatforming that we kind of alluded to a little bit earlier. When these forces, they go off mainstream and into the more dark places. What do you think that the effect of that has on misinformation, and kind of like where it's headed? Like, are we headed to a place where, it still happens, but it's just not as widely seen?
Sure. I'll start with your first question. It has been interesting to see what some of the defense attorneys have actually argued to the judges. And I think it's important to recognize that most of these arguments so far have been in the context of detention motions. So hearings in front of the court where the court is deciding whether the person is so dangerous or such a risk of flight that he should be detained prior to trial versus released on either personal recognizance or on some sort of other conditions of release. They might be monetary, but they might be non-monetary, like regular check-ins with a pretrial services officer, things like that. So I think partly the reason you're seeing those arguments about being brainwashed and feeling like the person had the permission from President Trump to engage in this activity, or from Trump surrogates, is partly to express to the judge, these people aren't in actual danger, right? They had this whole history. They don't have any criminal history, before this event. This was the result of brainwashing. If you let them go home on personal recognizance, they're not going to get into any trouble. I don't think we're going to see a lot of those arguments. And if we are, I think they're going to fail when you're talking about actually getting to trial for those who don't resolve their case through a plea agreement or something else. Because, it's not a defense to say, I was, listening to Fox News or, Breitbart or some other outlet that even much farther to the right that was, telling me that there was election fraud and I needed to do something about it. That's just not a legal defense. People take personal responsibility. It would have to go to the level of a person doing something under duress or under coercion. For it to really be a legal defense. I mean, defendants all the time talk about how they were influenced by this person or that person, and that might be very relevant for like their sentencing, for example, or how much they should, how culpable they are, but it's not really a legal defense. So we'll see if those defense attorneys maintain that type of argument when we get actually to the guilt or innocence phase. On the other question, though, about deplatforming, I think it is very significant. And we went through this, I will say, also when I was still in government and we were having conversations with some of the major platforms back in 2014 when horrible, violent conduct, such as beheadings, was being posted on social media, would go viral. And of course, all of reputable social media was taking down that type of content. But sometimes it was a little bit too late because it was already out there and all over the place. And one of the things, when I had some conversations with some of the principals at these companies, asking them to, put more resources into preventing this type of content from ever even emerging on the platform, they made some similar comments about, well, if we deplatform things, won't they just go to darker places? And won't that also impact the intelligence community's ability and the law enforcement community's ability to track and know what they're doing? But my view then and my view now remains that when we're talking about the major platforms that have such incredible reach, like Krishna was just discussing, it is still better to have that content off of those platforms because it is going to demonstrably decrease the number of people who encounter it. And partly it's because even when people then find another platform, there's just a barrier to entry. So many people have Facebook accounts. So many people have Twitter accounts and YouTube accounts. Many fewer people have accounts on some of those other, less globally popular platforms. And yes, extremists will find them. They will partake in them, but they will find each other anyway. What I'm more worried about is extremists appealing to non-extremists, appealing to, people who don't already harbor extremist views that might actually radicalize to violence. Because we saw that on January 6th, right? We saw a huge tent there. We had conspiracy theorists and QAnon theorists. We had accelerationists. We had militia violent extremists. We had white supremacists. And we had just ordinary people who came to Washington, having consumed disinformation about the election, but engaging otherwise in First Amendment rights. But that crowd, probably with no intent to overrun violently the Capitol Police or overrun the Capitol, but that crowd became part of the mob once those that were intending to use violence to stop the certification of the election, once they started that breach of the Capitol and started engaging in violence, the mob mentality went on and so many more people partook in it. And that's, that's the real life version of what I think happens on the internet when we're talking about massive platforms that are able to be used by extremists to spread content so widely, and that will ultimately draw some people to that extremist view who would not otherwise go there. And I think, and so even though I agree that the people who are most intent on promoting extremism and even organizing and mobilizing and committing even terrorist crimes, they will find each other and they will also act independently. But taking this out of the global reach is still a net benefit. And I think some of maybe Karen's statistics bear that out. One last point, because it came up earlier, that I think is also important to think about when it comes to the data that we're seeing now that Karen's organization, German Marshall Fund, has put out, is that just like after Charlottesville's Unite the Right, after Charlottesville that night, the participants were euphoric. They thought they'd been amazingly successful in stepping off of the virtual space into the physical space. But as the days passed and that international, condemnation rained down upon them, and people started getting charged with crimes, they started imploding, and they started backbiting and infighting and going a little bit dark for a while. We're seeing that same thing post January 6th. Right? Immediately, they were so proud of themselves, the people who participated. They're posting videos all over the place, which they're now, I think, very much regretting. But and then in the immediate days, as again that universal condemnation rained down upon them, and the government started making arrests and prosecutions, we saw a lot of things go quiet, and we saw new disinformation that January 6th was a honeypot, meaning a law enforcement trap, that it was an Antifa plot. Don't go out on January 20th, right? Don't talk on social media. And so, but eventually they'll get past that phase, and they'll start, getting back out there onto the more prominent platforms. They'll start spreading extremist views on those more prominent platforms until there is either some other event that quiets them down, or until we see more, more aggressive activity by the platforms themselves.
So when I was thinking about this platform or this presentation today and thinking about questions to ask, I was looking at the calendar, and I went back a year. And June 9th, 2020 was an incredibly different time. I mean, George Floyd had just been murdered. The election was kind of, a glimmer, still kind of far off. And we were dealing, very much with the pandemic, where we didn't have any vaccines in sight. All of that was going on. So we've got 2 minutes left. So this is going to have to be a bit of a lightning round. But I want to hear from each of you. In the last year, do you think that we've made a lot of progress on this front? Karen, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'll just share how I feel being on this panel. I feel like, when I listen to Mary, it just underscores that the disinformation is more and more harmful, more and more dangerous, and that we're falling further and further behind. And so that scares me. When I listen to Krishna, I think about how we could fight fire with fire. That we could take some of the modeling, the data, the AI tools that we have, and we actually could do something about it. So I'm very, very concerned about where we are right now, and that we haven't made more progress, and that the disinformation campaigners have gotten smarter and smarter and better at using these tools. And what we used to talk about in the early days of the internet was the long tail, that you can assemble small audiences. You don't have to appeal to the mass. That they're so good at that. Getting QAnon to the yoga moms, and so on and on and on. So I'm very, very concerned. But when I hear Krishna talking, I feel like if we could use some of that, bottle some of that lightning that he has, and really approach the problem with it, we could make a lot of progress fast. Krishna,
I'll go to you.
I think the problem that we are facing as a humanity is there's too much information, right? And there's too much information that we can ever consume. And back in the day, probably 100 years ago, something has happened somewhere, and we probably are not aware, and we are in our own bliss. While information is great, and now you apply algorithms on top of it. Now what you're doing is you're creating these bubbles, and everyone is in their own bubble, and everyone is consuming the information they're most likely to engage with. So you're reinforcing those beliefs, whether they're true or false, over time, and you're just dividing the this world and the society as a whole. So I think this is the dangerous situation where if you don't do anything about it, will create more and more division in the society as in the world as a whole. So this is where I feel like from a technologist point of view, we need to take responsibility, and we cannot just there has to be an element of societal connectedness in all the stuff that we do, right? So part of it is to ensure that how our algorithms are working, how are we actually using this information, how are we broadcasting it. So the good part about it is in the last 1-2 years, there is a rise in the interest of these technologies like explainable AI and monitoring and model governance and risk assessment. There's at least talk about this. There's some interest, some thought leaders are pursuing these things, working with companies like us. And I see like light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a lot of work. It needs like law enforcers. It needs civilians. It needs a whole bunch of people to come together to actually make this happen.
Okay, last comment, Mary. Are we any better off now than we were a year ago?
I totally associate myself with everything Karen and Krishna said. I'm so glad people like Krishna are out there who are actually have the technological capability to do something. But I will tell you, the continued proliferation and of disinformation and adoption of it by elected officials and leaders for political purposes scares the hell out of me. And this is seriously undermines our democracy, and the polarization seems right now almost insurmountable to me, and that's not a good place to be. And so I really would love to see so much.
Oh, well, we lost Mary.
I think that was a signal that my time was up, so thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all, Mary, Krishna, Karen, for joining us today. This has been such a fascinating conversation on such an important topic. And I will hand it over now to the people at the NYC Media Lab. Thanks so much.